Remember going to lunch when you were in high school? Remember that lunch hour? I used to love lunch when I was in high school. We had all sorts of different options that we could choose from every day. But I tell you, I ate the same thing just about every day. It was like either Pizza Hut pizza or soft tacos. That was about it. And I would sit with the same group of friends, and I would sit at the same table every day. But I loved it. It was my favorite part of the school day. And you know, high school lunch, it can be a fun part of the day, but it can also be a time of division and rivalry. What table did you sit at in high school? Did you sit with the cool kids or with the nerds? Did you sit at that table that was not so affectionately called the loser table? Did you sit with the athletes or the cheerleaders? What table was your table? You know, the high school lunch table can assign you an identity. It can teach you your place within the school's caste system. And in today's Dining Room Diva, we look at a time when that kind of thinking unfortunately infiltrated the church, and how a key leader in the church was at the very center of it. We're reading Galatians 2, verses 11 through 14. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter, in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?" This passage describes a confrontation between Paul and Peter. Peter, who was in charge of the church, who Christ had called to lead the church. Peter evidently traveled from Jerusalem to Antioch for a visit, and he had been associating with Christians, of all Christians, Jewish and Gentile Christians both, during his visit. But then, Paul says, other men came from the Jerusalem church, men from James. That just means Jewish Christians from Jerusalem. But these were Jewish Christians who placed a high value on the law of Moses. And it appears that Peter began acting favorably toward the Jewish Christians who were following the law of Moses, and he began to ignore the Gentile Christians. And this began to create division within the church at Antioch. Now, it probably wasn't Peter's intention to create conflict, right? I mean, he may have even thought that spending more time with these Jews who had just come in as guests from out of town, that maybe he was going to help keep the peace between the two groups of people, right? When we have an expression that says that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Or maybe he just wanted to hang out with his friends who'd come from Jerusalem for a visit. But the effect of what he was doing, it began to create a situation where the Gentiles began to be treated as second-class citizens within the church. And it wasn't that Peter didn't associate with Gentiles. He did, until other people came around. I mean, he was kind of like that kid in high school that leaves his friends because he's invited to sit at the cool kids' table, right? But it was actually far worse than that, because other people followed his example. Peter's actions led to the acceptance of this idea that Jews should only eat with Jews and Gentiles should only eat with Gentiles. And this is actually, it becomes a lot less like our lunch table example and more like the racial segregation that we saw in America's past. I remember my dad telling me about separate restrooms that he had in his high school in the 1960s. You know, one restroom for black kids and another for white kids. And I remember being shocked as he described that to me because, I mean, I knew segregation was a thing in the South, but here in northern Indiana, it was hard for me to wrap my mind around that. But Peter refusing to eat with the Gentiles was having the same kind of effect on the church in Antioch as segregation did here in the United States. That created two classes of people, those who were acceptable to associate with and those who weren't quite good enough. Now, Peter knew better. Peter certainly knew better than this. I mean, The first sermon he ever preached in Acts 2 at Pentecost, he said that the gospel was for all people, not just Jews, but Gentiles as well. In Acts chapter 10, God had revealed to Peter that salvation was for the Gentiles as well, and not just to the Jews, when Peter visited a man named Cornelius, who was not Jewish. And then Peter affirmed at the council in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 that the Gentiles had been accepted by God without being circumcised. So we can ask, why did Peter do this? Paul says that he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. And we might ask, afraid? I mean, he was the leader of the church. He was the one that Jesus had called to lead the church. What was he afraid of? Perhaps he was afraid that after he left Antioch and he went back to Jerusalem, maybe he was afraid of being persecuted for hanging out with the Gentiles. I don't know. But like a lot of high school kids, Peter gave in to peer pressure. Look, Peter wasn't perfect. Paul wasn't perfect either. I mean, none of us are perfect. Sometimes we just don't live up to what we know to be true. And when we fall short, it can cause big problems in Christ's church. And sometimes we need somebody like Paul to confront us, like he confronted Peter. And he confronted the others who participated in what amounted to racial segregation during the communion service. And good for Paul. Good for Paul for having the courage to call out a beloved Christian brother who was making a big mistake. I want to close with a question today. Do we put up with cliques inside the church? I think if we're honest, I think sometimes we do. And it may not even be intentional, right? I mean, we hang out with our friends. We hang out with the people that we know the best. But if we're not careful, we can leave people feeling left out in the process. Well, the church isn't the high school cafeteria. We don't have tables in the church. There's one table, Christ's table, and he invites all of us to sit at it. So have the courage to break outside of your table. Have the courage to do that. Be the first to associate with people that you haven't before. Break down walls of race, of age, economic status, or status within the church. Because there is one body, there is one faith, and we are called, we are blessed to be a part of it. Let's live into that reality. Thank you for watching our video. We'll see you next time with Dining with Devos.